6 hypersonic missiles. 1 battery. 4 minutes. March 7, 2026, 2:19 a.m. Somewhere in central Ukraine, buried under camouflage netting and frozen earth, the operators of a Ukrainian Patriot air defense battery sat in the blue glow of their targeting displays. Outside, -11 degrees. The fields around them were silent. The nearest village was 14 kilometers away. At 2:19 a.m. and 43 seconds, the radar screen changed. 6 tracks. Inbound. High supersonic. Altitude decreasing. The computer tagged them immediately. 47 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles launched from MiG-31K Foxhound aircraft operating over the Caspian corridor, more than 1,000 kilometers to the east. The fire control system calculated their trajectories, closing speeds, projected impact zones. The numbers populated the screen in cold white numerals. One projected impact point was a major Ukrainian city. Another was a rail hub moving Western military supplies. A third pointed at a hospital complex that had been receiving casualties from the front for 11 consecutive months. The battery commander, known to his crew only by his call sign, Falcon, looked at the display for exactly 4 seconds. Then he made a decision that would define the night. He told his crew to wait. What you're about to hear is the story of how 6 missiles traveling at Mach 10 were stopped by a single crew that had spent months training for a scenario everyone assumed was impossible. Not because the technology couldn't handle it, because the geometry of the engagement left almost no margin. One wrong timing call and at least one Kinzhal reaches its target. One miscalculation in the intercept queue and the second salvo arrives before the system can reset. The crew knew this, and they waited anyway. This is War Vector. Tonight, we're breaking down what Ukrainian defense officials would later describe as the most precise single-salvo Kinzhal defeat in the entire history of this conflict. Let's go back to where it started. Russia's doctrine of aerial terror had changed significantly by the winter of 2025. In the early years of the war, Russian missile strikes were devastating, but often tactically crude. Large salvos of Shahed 136 drones mixed with Kaliber cruise missiles, designed to overwhelm Ukrainian air defense through quantity rather than precision. Ukrainian crews and their Western-supplied systems adapted. Shoot-down rates improved. The salvos became predictable. By late 2025, Russian planners had shifted. They studied the failure patterns of their own strikes and arrived at a doctrine that military analysts at the Institute for the Study of War would later call engagement queue saturation. The concept was simple. Don't try to outrun the interceptor. Outrun the reload. The Patriot PAC-3 MSE is one of the most capable missile defense systems on Earth. Its hit-to-kill kinetic warhead can engage targets from near surface to the edge of the stratosphere. Against a single Kinzhal, the system performs with extraordinary reliability. Ukrainian crews operating Patriots had already proven this. Multiple individual Kinzhal intercepts had been confirmed through 2024 and 2025, each remarkable given the missile's claimed Mach 10 terminal velocity and hypersonic glide characteristics. But the Patriot battery has finite resources. A firing unit has a defined number of ready interceptors. Engaging them in rapid succession against multiple targets strains the reload and re-engagement cycle. Russian planners had studied this carefully. They knew that if they could force a Ukrainian battery to expend its initial engagement queue against a first wave, the second wave would arrive before the system fully reset. The staggered Kinzhal salvo was their answer. Which weapon system did Ukraine rely on most to stop the threat that night? Patriot PAC-3 MSE, the radar data link network, or the crew's own tactical judgment? Comment A, B, or C. We'll come back to this. The March 7th engagement had been preceded by 48 hours of unusual Russian air activity. Ukrainian signals intelligence, drawing on both domestic assets and intelligence shared through NATO channels, had tracked a significant repositioning of MiG-31K aircraft, the dedicated Kinzhal carrier, from their normal staging bases at Savoslayka and Monchegorsk to forward positions closer to the Caspian corridor. The move wasn't unusual in itself. Russian forces regularly rotated Kinzhal-capable aircraft through forward positions. But the volume was different. Ukrainian analysts noted that the number of Foxhounds moving into Caspian range positions over the 72 hours prior to March 7th was roughly twice the normal rotation figure. This reached Ukrainian Air Force Command and was flagged to active Patriot crews as an elevated threat indicator. Falcon's battery, already at heightened readiness, moved to a pre-planned alternate firing position 41 hours before the engagement. Position relocation is a survival tactic. Ukrainian Patriot crews had learned early in the war that a battery staying static for more than 48 hours becomes vulnerable to counter-battery strikes. Falcon's crew executed the move in darkness, dismantling their position, driving convoy along a pre-surveyed route, and re-establishing the system at the new site before first light. What they didn't know was that the alternate position they selected, through careful pre-survey, terrain analysis, and what one crew member would later describe simply as instinct, placed them in a near-geometrically ideal intercept position relative to the Caspian approach corridor. The position offered a radar line of sight that extended further east than their previous site. When the Kinzhal tracks appeared at 2:19 a.m., Falcon's battery was tracking them with 14 additional seconds of data compared to what the old location would have provided. 14 seconds. In hypersonic missile intercept, 14 seconds is an ocean of time. I spent hours going through the tactical reconstruction reports on this engagement, and one detail kept coming back to me. The position change 41 hours earlier wasn't ordered by higher command. Falcon made the call himself. His crew had developed a pattern of proactive position cycling that went beyond what was formally required, because Falcon had told his team repeatedly that the battery staying alive was as important as the battery shooting. You cannot intercept anything if you've been hit first. That philosophy, quiet, unglamorous, deeply professional, is what put them in the right place when it mattered most. Stay with me. Because what happens in the next 18 minutes destroys the logic of Russia's most advanced aerial strike doctrine, the Kinzhal. NATO designation AS-24 Killjoy is not a conventional missile. It's a derivative of the Iskander-M ballistic missile, modified for air launch from a MiG-31K at altitude. Launched from approximately 15,000 to 18,000 meters, it follows an aeroballistic trajectory. Boosted to hypersonic speed in the initial phase, then maneuvering during terminal approach. Russian state media had for years called it invincible, a weapon that could defeat any Western air defense system through sheer speed and trajectory unpredictability. Ukraine had already shown this claim was false. Multiple confirmed Kinzhal intercepts through 2024 and early 2025 established that the Patriot system, operated by a well-trained crew, could engage the missile reliably under the right conditions. Russia absorbed these failures and developed the staggered salvo doctrine specifically to defeat a crew that had already demonstrated competence. The 6 Kinzhals launched on March 7th were not fired simultaneously. Russian planners sequenced the launch deliberately. 3 missiles from the first pair of MiG-31Ks, then a 2-minute gap, then 3 more from a second pair. The delay was calculated. It was long enough that the first 3 missiles would be deep into their terminal phase, demanding immediate engagement, before the second 3 became trackable. If the battery expended interceptors on the first group and then had to execute a reload cycle, the second 3 would arrive in the window of minimum readiness. By any honest assessment, it was a sophisticated evolution of Russian aerial doctrine. On paper, the staggered Kinzhal salvo was a genuine attempt to defeat a proven Western system through tactical innovation rather than raw capability. What's most surprising about this engagement isn't that Ukraine won. It's the specific reason the Russian tactic failed. At 2:19 a.m. and 43 seconds, Falcon saw the first 3 tracks appear on his display. The AN/MPQ-65 Patriot phased array in full active mode gave him tracking data immediately. The closing speed of the lead missile computed at approximately 3,200 meters per second, distance to maximum intercept range, decreasing rapidly. The fire control system began generating intercept solutions automatically. Falcon told his crew to hold, not because he doubted the system, because he had studied the staggered salvo concept in tabletop exercises for 6 months. Ukrainian Air Defense Command had briefed all active Patriot crews on the specific parameters of a 2-wave staggered attack, drawing on intelligence analysis of Russian strike planning collected through late 2025. The briefings were detailed. They included projected timing intervals, estimated launch sequences, and a recommended tactical response. The recommendation was exactly what Falcon had already decided to do. Allow the first wave to close to a distance where intercept solutions are highly reliable. Begin engagement late enough that reload and re-engagement time will be minimized for the second wave. Accept increased personal risk. Missiles closer means less margin for error, in exchange for maximizing system availability when the trailing group arrives. It was the right call. It was also the most nerve-wracking 2 minutes any crew member on that battery would ever experience. How many Kinzhal missiles had been confirmed defeated by Ukrainian Patriot systems before this engagement? We'll give you the answer at the end. But first, subscribe to War Vector if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. This is exactly the kind of engagement that rewrites doctrine. At 2:21 a.m. and 12 seconds, 1 minute and 29 seconds after initial track acquisition, Falcon gave the fire command. The first Pac-3 MSE interceptor left the launcher. A second followed within seconds, a third. Against Kinzhals at terminal velocity, the crew was firing in pairs to ensure kill probability. The intercept geometry was tight. The Kinzhals were already inside 40 kilometers, descending, their terminal approach velocity enormous. The intercept solutions were good. The crew had run this in simulation more times than they could count. The first Kinzhal disappeared from the display at 2:21 a.m. and 31 seconds. Destroyed. The second track went dark at 2:21 a.m. and 44 seconds. the third. And this is the moment crew members would describe afterward as the longest 4 seconds of their lives. The third track wavered. For a fraction of a moment, the intercept solution looked uncertain. The kill vehicle was tracking. The geometry was marginal. The third track disappeared at 2:21 a.m. and 58 seconds. 3 for 3. First wave destroyed. And now the clock reset. Here's the part that doesn't make sense on the surface. The crew had just expended a significant portion of their ready interceptors. They had minutes, at most, before the second wave became trackable. Every fire control specialist on every Patriot battery will tell you that this is the moment of maximum vulnerability. After an engagement, before full readiness is restored. Falcon's crew had already anticipated this. They had not fired pairs on all 3 targets. On the second Kinzhal, based on a slightly more favorable approach angle, the fire control officer had recommended a single interceptor shot. Falcon approved it. The calculation saved 1 ready interceptor that would otherwise have been committed to the first wave. A micro decision made in real time under conditions most people cannot fully imagine. It mattered. At 2:22 a.m. and 8 seconds, the second wave appeared on the display. 3 more Kinzhal tracks, exactly as Russian planners had designed. 2 minutes and 25 seconds behind the first group. The crew had used that window to execute exactly what the battery's standard operating procedures required. The reload cycle was not complete. It couldn't be, in that time. But the fire control system was reset. Intercept solutions were being generated, and the crew's readiness state had been confirmed. The second engagement began at 2:22 a.m. and 40 seconds. The fire commands came faster now. The second wave's approach geometry was similar to the first. The crew's process memory from the previous minutes directly applicable. No deliberation. Execution. 4th track eliminated. 5th track eliminated. The 6th. The trailing missile of the second wave, flying the lowest approach trajectory of all 6, reached a point 31 kilometers from the Patriot launcher before the interceptor found it. The detonation was visible from the ground. 14 kilometers away, in a village whose residents had heard the distant thunder of the first engagements, windows lit with a Flash 1 resident described to a local journalist as like lightning that didn't move. At 2:23 a.m. and 17 seconds, the display in Falcon's fire control station showed 6 empty tracks where 6 Kinzhal missiles had been. The crew said nothing for approximately 8 seconds. Then the radio discipline broke. Satellite imagery analysis, conducted by commercial operators and shared through open-source intelligence networks in the days following, confirmed no impact craters in any of the projected target areas. Ukrainian General Staff reports issued on March 8th confirmed 6 Kinzhal missiles launched and 6 intercepted. U.S. Defense officials, speaking on background to American media, confirmed the intercept and described it as the largest confirmed single-salvo Kinzhal defeat of the war. 6 hypersonic missiles in a single engagement against a specifically designed saturation attack profile. It had not been done before. Here's the take that may get us some pushback, and we're going to say it plainly. Russia's staggered Kinzhal salvo doctrine was not a failure of Russian engineering. It was a failure of Russian intelligence. The assumption embedded in that tactic was that Ukrainian crews would respond to the first wave with standard engagement protocols. Maximum intercept probability on each target, maximum interceptor expenditure. The assumption was wrong because Ukrainian training had specifically addressed it. Falcon's crew didn't prevail because they were faster or because their equipment was better. They prevailed because someone in Ukrainian Air Defense Command had done the analytical work to anticipate the Russian adaptation, built a training program around the specific counter-response, and trusted their crews to execute it under live fire. That's a systemic intelligence and training success. It's also a quiet indictment of Russian tactical analysis, which appears to have underestimated Ukrainian learning speed by a significant margin. Again, put yourself in Falcon's position for a second. You see 3 hypersonic missiles on your display. Your system can engage them. Your crew is ready. Every instinct says fire now. Maximize probability of kill. Protect the asset. And you have to override that instinct deliberately, because analysts you've never met told you there are 3 more missiles you can't see yet, and the only way to stop all 6 is to accept more risk on the first 3, so you have capacity left for the rest. That is not a technical challenge. It's a psychological one. And Falcon's crew cleared it without hesitation. Will Russia develop a 3rd-generation Kinzhal saturation doctrine that accounts for the Ukrainian counter-response demonstrated on March 7th? Comment yes or no, because the answer changes what Ukrainian air defense planners have to prepare for next. The debrief conducted by Ukrainian Air Defense Command in the days following produced a documentation package later shared, in partially redacted form, with NATO partners. The package ran to several hundred pages, but its conclusions, as summarized in a briefing to Allied air defense commanders, were direct. First, proactive position cycling below the formal requirement threshold provides strategic advantage. Falcon's early relocation gave them radar coverage that would not otherwise have been available. Second, Single interceptor engagement on favorable geometry targets, when crew confidence and real-time assessment support it, is a valid conservation measure. The doctrine of committing pairs to every Kinzhal regardless of geometry was revised. Third, pre-briefing on known or anticipated Russian saturation tactics, including specific engagement hold recommendations, is a force multiplier. The crew's ability to execute the deliberate hold on the first wave was entirely a product of training. The training existed because Ukrainian intelligence had done the analytical work and pushed it to operational crews. Fourth, crew psychological preparation for maximum stress hold decisions requires specific conditioning. Running tabletop exercises is insufficient. The Ukrainian Air Defense Command began developing live fire simulation scenarios that specifically practiced the hold decision, forcing crew members to override their trained engagement instinct under realistic stress, as a direct result of studying Falcon's engagement. One detail stuck with me through all of this. In the crew footage released weeks after the engagement, location data removed, faces partially visible, audio partially edited for operational security, you can see the battery commander in the seconds between the third intercept and the appearance of the second wave's tracks. He is not moving, not speaking. He is watching the display, completely still. Later, in an interview conducted by Ukrainian media with his face obscured and his voice altered, Falcon was asked what he was thinking in those 8 seconds between the first and second engagements. He said he was thinking about the village 14 kilometers behind the battery. The combat footage shows operators at their stations for the entire engagement sequence. What it cannot convey, what no footage can, is the weight carried by 23 people in a dark vehicle in a frozen field, knowing that the math of their decisions would be measured in kilometers of blast radius if they got it wrong. If you believe that tactical discipline wins modern wars more often than raw technology, type war vector in the comments. Because this engagement is the clearest evidence yet. The aftermath extended beyond the immediate tactical assessment. Russian air operations over the Caspian corridor did not cease. That would have been strategically unsustainable. But the specific Kinzhal via Foxhound strike pattern against central Ukrainian targets was not repeated for 31 days following the engagement. Ukrainian signals intelligence tracked the resumed repositioning of MiG-31K aircraft to Caspian range positions in early April, but the sortie patterns showed modification. Analysts noted what appeared to be changes in the timing sequencing of launches, suggesting Russian planners were iterating the staggered salvo model in response to the March 7th failure. The war, as always, continued to adapt. On the broader strategic level, the 6 Kinzhal intercept had an effect that went beyond tactical doctrine. Russia had publicly claimed in multiple state media broadcasts that the Kinzhal was a weapon no existing Western system could defeat. Each successful intercept eroded that narrative. 6 in a single night, against a specifically designed saturation attack, collapsed it. Ukrainian officials, in carefully worded statements, confirmed the intercept without disclosing specifics. The effect on Ukrainian public morale, documented in polling conducted in the week following, was measurable. Air raid alerts had become a daily psychological burden on the population. Knowing that Patriot crews were stopping hypersonic salvos specifically engineered to defeat them carried real weight. What NATO would have done differently is a question worth sitting with seriously. The alliance's own doctrine for Patriot employment had not, as of early 2026, formally incorporated the deliberate engagement hold as a standard tactic against staggered salvo attacks. The Ukrainian refinement, developed through intelligence analysis, operational experience, and crew initiative, was ahead of NATO's formal procedural documentation. Several NATO member nations operating Patriot systems received the Ukrainian debrief package and were reportedly incorporating the engagement hold training into their own crew preparation programs as a direct result. This is what real-time warfare innovation actually looks like, not the clean linear flow from doctrine to training to execution that military schools describe. Intelligence analysis identifies an adversary adaptation. Command pushes that analysis directly to operational crews. A crew acts on it under live fire. A post-engagement documentation process translates individual success into institutional knowledge. Ukraine has been running this loop faster than Russia throughout this war. The 6 Kinzhal night is simply the most dramatic single example of what that speed advantage produces. Here's what this tells us about where this conflict stands in mid-2026. Russia entered this war with a doctrine built on the assumption that its aerospace forces would operate without credible opposition, that Ukrainian air defenses would be suppressed in the opening days, and that Russian aircraft and missiles would range freely over Ukrainian territory. That assumption failed in the war's first week and has continued failing in increasingly sophisticated ways ever since. The Kinzhal was supposed to be the answer to Patriot. March 7th showed that there is no static answer. There is only the race to adapt faster than the adversary can counter. Ukrainian air defense crews are winning that race. The Patriot battery that Falcon commanded remained operational after March 7th. It continued its position cycling routine. The crew received formal commendation from Ukrainian Air Force Command. Falcon, in his partially anonymized interview, declined to describe himself or his crew as heroes. He said they were professionals who had done their job. He said the people who deserved recognition were the analysts who had identified the staggered salvo threat months before it was used, and the training staff who had built the response protocol into the battery's muscle memory. That kind of institutional humility, crediting the system rather than the individual, is a marker of a mature military organization. The Ukrainian armed forces in 2026 are not the force that existed in February 2022. They have been shaped through 4 years of combat into something that multiple Western military analysts have described, without exaggeration, as one of the most combat-experienced and tactically innovative militaries on Earth. Real battles, real tactics, real consequences. War vector. The city that had been targeted that night woke to normal morning traffic. The hospital continued receiving casualties. The rail hub moved another train of supplies westward. 14 kilometers from the Patriot battery, in the village whose windows had lit with the flash of the 6th intercept, a resident who had watched through a crack in the curtains looked at the sky and went back to sleep. They did not know what had happened. They did not need to. Someone had been awake in the dark. Someone had done the calculation. Someone had chosen to wait. And the sky stayed clear. Now, the answer to the quiz from earlier. We asked, how many Kinzhal missiles had been confirmed defeated by Ukrainian Patriot systems before this engagement? The honest answer, based on open-source confirmation through Ukrainian General Staff reports and corroborating Western official statements, is that multiple individual Kinzhal intercepts had been publicly confirmed spanning 2023 through early 2026. The specific number varied depending on which engagements met the threshold of dual-source confirmation, but the range most consistently cited in serious analytical sources was between 7 and 12 individual missiles prior to March 7th. The significance of the March 7th engagement was not that it was the first Kinzhal intercept. It was the first confirmed defeat of a deliberately coordinated multi-missile saturation salvo, specifically designed to defeat the intercepting system. That distinction mattered. 6 missiles in a staggered 2-wave sequence designed to exhaust engagement queue, stopped by 1 crew in 4 minutes, in the dark. 3 questions worth sitting with after this engagement. Was Falcon's decision to hold fire on the first wave the right call? He made it work, but the margin was real. If the 3rd missile in the first wave had not been intercepted, if the geometry had been slightly worse, the intercept solution slightly less favorable, the 2nd wave would have arrived at a battery in partial reload with 1 confirmed miss on the board. The tactic succeeded because the crew executed it perfectly. Does perfect execution validate the tactic, or does it simply mean the tactic was sound and the crew happened to be good enough? There's a meaningful distinction there for anyone designing doctrine. Could Russia have prevented the failure? The intelligence gap appears to have been the critical failure, an underestimation of Ukrainian training sophistication. Russian planners designed the staggered salvo around an assumption about how Ukrainian crews would respond. That assumption was wrong because Ukrainian training had specifically addressed it. A more rigorous assessment of Ukrainian air defense adaptation speed might have caught this, or it might not. The Ukrainian counter-response was developed and distributed quietly, exactly to prevent it from being anticipated. What would you have done differently in Falcon's position at 2:21 a.m. with 3 hypersonic missiles closing at 3,200 meters per second and 3 more you couldn't see yet? Subscribe to War Vector. We break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Every engagement we cover is chosen because it contains something that changes how militaries think about conflict. A tactical innovation, a doctrinal failure, a moment where human judgment under pressure determined an outcome that technology alone could not have predicted. This is one of those moments. The fields outside that concealed firing position are quiet now. The camouflage netting is gone, the battery long since relocated. The only evidence of what happened there on March 7th, 2026, is a faint scorch mark in the frozen earth where the system's exhaust deflectors met the ground during the launch sequence, and a set of coordinates known only to the crew that stood there. No monument, no marker. 6 tracks that went dark on a display, and 23 people who knew what it meant. Silent reminders that modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy. The sky doesn't grade on a curve. Stay vigilant.